They are looking to Brazil, Latin America, Africa, and cities the world over. All eyes trained on the next big thing. Please welcome investors and inventors Shaun Abrahamson, Jon Gosier, Bedy Yang, and Nico Berardi. They're joined by Richard Florida.
Hey guys, we've been having a day-long conversation about how Miami has matured as a startup ecosystem, how much has happened, what are the key assets, the key challenges, how the investments, how this ecosystem has grown. And I think now we want to broaden it out to really think openly and honestly about what are these new epicenters, what are these new startup ecosystems that are growing up, not just in the obvious places. Obviously, the San Francisco Bay Area remains the #1 startup ecosystem in the world, and New York has come up in the greater Boston area, and Austin and Seattle, London, Berlin, Toronto. But I think we also want to talk about some of these emerging startup hubs. And maybe, as we talk about that, is there a way for Miami? Earlier on, I talked about this great international airport, the phenomenal diversity, the waves of immigration. Is there a way for Miami to capitalize on this mixing and melting pot? So I want to start with Bedy. Bedy Yang is the managing partner for Brazil and Latin America for 500 startups, a global investment fund, an accelerator for startups all over the world. 500 startups has invested in more than 800 companies in 40 countries across the world. Bedy, what are you seeing in your work? What are you seeing around the world as these startup ecosystems grow? How are they maturing? What are they looking like? And do you see anything, particularly in your work in Latin America, we work so many places, is there a way that Miami can create some leverage, or is it happening on all around us?
So we actually updated a little bit of information because we grow so fast. So it's about 1,000 startups, 50 countries.
Congratulations.
12 countries that we have operation. The way we look at sort of startup ecosystem and when we see potential, I think there's definitely what you brought up, like the obvious cities, and then you have the Silicon Valley, New York, London, Berlin. But then what we actually believe, like any macro region with a population of 1 million people sort of in that geography that you can launch a product and test a product and take it global. Actually, most of the boundaries right now, it's not so much geographic, but it's more like, do you have the network, do you have the knowledge, do you have the investors to help you take to the next stage? So we've been really active at looking at multiple locations with the team members in different parts of the world. And specifically to Latin America, we're really big on Latin America. We have 5 people working in the organization and investment team, and then over 125 sort of deals that we've done over the past 4 years. And naturally, Miami can become, sometimes we joke, it's the capital of Latin America.
Yeah.
And actually, we do a lot of activities, particularly for investors. We believe like there's one side of it, which is you have to make sure that the talent and the culture is there. But on the other hand, what's going to really help deepen the ecosystem and the relationship there, it's the other investors. So we've been doing a lot more here in Miami, particularly working with other co-investors. So last week, we ended up doing an event called Pre-Money. And the first time we did it outside of the Valley was in Miami, and a lot of people ask us, hey, can you do it here, can you do it there? There are not that many. Actually, there may be like 5 other hub of hubs, how you want to call that we feel like this is a relevant place for us to be. So we're really positive about the potential that is being built here. I think it might give people a little bit of impression that it's a little bit superficial, but we believe like a lot of dev can be built
Let me push
throughout.
on this. I like this concept of a hub of hubs. I called it a superstar city, but I actually think it's much smarter. I'm going to steal it. But if you think about the obvious hub of hubs, the Bay Area, New York, because of financial, and London. Miami? What is it that would make Miami a hub of hubs? I could grasp at a few things, but why is it playing in this space which you wouldn't maybe expect?
Yeah, for us specifically, it's more like where do you build the relevancy for the startups itself, right? So I could take the 125 deals that we've done in Latin America and take it to London, but I think people will not think that that's relevant. Well, if I take it here, like different parts of like investors will come to Miami, and even when we try to convince like really great investors from the Bay Area or New York to come here, that's a very easy conversation to sort of dive in. So the concept of hub, it's because we are really big in Spanish-speaking and Latin America, and the relevancy sort of converge here, which is like, if you have like different conversation, for instance, for like Middle East, then probably that's for Dubai. Is that a hub that people have thought about being a hub for the Middle East? Maybe yes, maybe no, but that's definitely capital, and there's definitely a lot that you can build sort of for the region. And that's how we look at Miami. Like we can build something for the region, for Latin America here.
Jon, I have a phonetic spelling of your name, but you can help me. It's Gosier?
It's Gosier.
Gosier. I was in the wrong place. Gosier. Jon lives in Philly, and he's a venture capitalist, and he founder and CEO of App Africa, an advisory services firm that helps technology and innovation companies in Africa. But I want you to talk about two things. One, a little bit about your experience just building technology and data analytics companies, and maybe a little about Philly. But I think for all of us, Africa is not the first place when we think of technology. I ran an awards program for Philips, Livable Cities. We gave great awards for Livable Cities projects in Africa, but it's not the first place that you think of for startups and technology, but in many ways an interesting place. So maybe tell us a little bit about your take on startup ecosystems in the world, but particularly drill down a little for all of us who don't have the knowledge about what's happening and going on in Africa.
So what's interesting is neither is Philadelphia. And Philly has actually got a lot in common in that it's got great talent. It's not really well known as being a tech hub, and yet there's been a couple of small wins that are encouraging to outside parties. Africa is a big place, and there are a number of cities where there's like these sparks of activity. Nairobi in Kenya, Lagos in Nigeria, Cape Town, South Africa, Kampala, Uganda is where I got started. The startup ecosystem in Africa is really growing. It's nascent, but exciting nonetheless. I think just the sheer numbers on the continent and the progress that it's making are really exciting. There's 327 newly middle-income consumers in Africa. Which, if you look at it as a whole, is actually larger than the middle class of India. So there's a number of challenges, there's hurdles, there's legal barriers, et cetera, but I think the numbers and the progress Africa has made over the past 50 years is starting to look really promising for venture capitalists and private equity investors.
I want to build on that. You know, we've gone through these waves of urbanization. First in the Western countries, we're 80 or 90% urbanized in the US and Europe. China is now the great wave of urbanization in all these cities with 1 million people. I forget what it is, but a majority of the Chinese people live in urban centers now. But there are two remaining waves of urbanization, the Southeast Asian and then finally the African wave. And I think it's really interesting, this part about how urbanity and startups go together. My question to you is, you know, when we talk to young people here in Miami, even in Philly, my students in Toronto, more and more of them want to be startup entrepreneurs, right? That it's a germ, it's a bug, it's a virus. They don't want to be the company man. Nothing wrong with that. My dad was a company man. Is this same thing happening with young people in Africa, or is it different?
Yeah, so the demographics almost demand it. So you have, across the continent, you have 80%, actually around 70% people under the age of 30. And for those people, there's not a lot of opportunity. They can't rely on government to create jobs for them. They're not relying on NGOs to do it. And so what do? There's two things that, two ways this story can go. One is you have a very entrepreneurial continent of people creating their own jobs and creating startups, et cetera. Or you have tons of negative influences trying to draw that youthful energy away. So this is where you have problems like Boko Haram and some of the other things going on across the continent. And you know, That's not exactly something that's scaled yet, but for good reasons. But what's exciting about Africa is the upside. What happens when the continent, this young continent, really starts to find its way in creating opportunities for trade with the rest of the world?
I think what you're saying is right, that people want a purpose and meaning in their life. And if you don't give them a purpose and meaning in their life, they're going to turn to other things. But we'd call them non-productive or dangerous things. One of the things we know about the U.S. And the Silicon Valley in particular is that it really harnessed entrepreneurs from the worldwide. It wasn't American ingenuity, sorry. It was the ingenuity of all these people who couldn't, whether they be European, whether they be Asian, whether they be Indian, whether they be Latin. They couldn't do it in their home country. And then what we learned from a great professor out at Berkeley, Annalise Exanian, that there were these diasporas that grew up, right? A really cool thing. So the Indian entrepreneurs that made it in the Valley brought their ideas back to India. So are we seeing any of that with the African entrepreneurial community, what she called not a brain drain, but a brain circulation? Or is it too emergent for us to see that?
I think it's interesting. So there are a number of what we call the reaspirants. So people returning to the continent with the skills and the expertise that they built elsewhere. I think that that's the next big opportunity for Africa. The capital of reaspirants or people who are coming back home is starting to be leveraged in the form of angel investments, in the form of startup capital and equity capital for these companies. So I think absolutely that's a necessity. My question, I think the question it begs is, will there start to be more of these pools of diaspora activity here in the Valley, right? If you have, someone succeed here in the States or in Miami, around the country, will you start to see more African diasporans build companies here in the States?
And I think you're right, that this becomes almost a kind of diplomacy or a foreign policy that's so much better than trying to teach people America is great, but this idea that you make it and learn entrepreneurship, learn how to build a company, realize your dream. Nico, I have so many things for you, but I think I want to start in a different place than I thought. Didn't you just come back from Israel?
I did, yesterday.
And we both have deep ties to Israel, and I know you and Matt and others. Why don't we start there and then go back? And Nico is managing director of Accelerated Growth Partners. Knight Foundation Support has a venture capital fund for early stage entrepreneurs. Why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us about what you saw, what you learned, and if there's any takeaways from us there?
Yeah.
I know you're probably still a little jet lagged.
It was a full week with a delegation of 10 people from Miami, and we were in Israel. And it was a little too much to take, so take everything I say, aside from the jet lag, with a grain of salt, because I'm still kind of processing through everything we went through. But Israel, as you may or may not know, has an incredible high-tech scene. And when I say high-tech scene, is because that's exactly what I'm referring to. We met with double PhDs that were looking, with developing breathalyzers that can detect cancer before full-on studies can do it. We met the founder or the creator of the Iron Dome, so this anti-missile thing that intercepts things at 5,000 kilometers an hour. So that's really incredible. And then we also got to go to Ramallah in the West Bank, when there's, it's a bustling city. And there's, there's funds, there's accelerators, and this in the middle of the West Bank, right? Yep. So to your point that entrepreneurs really are everywhere. Now, I think that connectivity, and this is something that the Knight Foundation has been working on, and how all the entrepreneurs connect with each other, how they connect with all the different resources, with the capital sources, et cetera, is key. And I think Miami, coming back from Israel, something that we learned is that we can be sort of that hub for the region, right? So going back to Ramallah for a second, they were saying that it's a perfect kind of testing ground. If something works in the West Bank, it's apparently the petri dish for anything that can then spread to the rest of the Arab world. Talking about technologies and new products, et cetera. And I think we can draw some similarities with Miami, right? If we can do it here, it's very easy to scale from here. Well, not very easy, but it's easier to do from here and spread on to the rest of Latin America.
You know, it's interesting. We went to Israel recently. We have a project in Jerusalem, and the night before we had a dinner with Don and Mira Rubel, the great art collectors, and they said, tell them about Zach the Baker. No, think about that. Tell them about Zach the Baker. Like, we have this kid who drew on his own origin, and he's got like the hippest bakery. And with Israel, I mean, it's a natural for here. I mean, it is such a natural for that two-way. You know, we were in Jerusalem. Almost everyone we met with had some tie, not to Miami, but greater South Florida. In Tel Aviv, there is a tie, and I just think, you know, we always think about we obviously think about Latin America, but this is a hub in many ways of cross-culture. And I think, you know, you think back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it wasn't tech startup nation. It was down in the dumps nation, with a lot of difficulties, right? Security difficulties. It took 10 years or 15 years, but it's now startup nation. And it's not just Tel Aviv, right? That's what I want you to, it's Jerusalem, it's Ramallah, it's spreading. We went to a little place in the territories where a Palestinian guy had opened up a small version of the Lab Miami. Yep. What do you think? Is that a dream that could happen?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually an accelerator in the Gaza Strip. Which is like 1.2 million people, as to Bedy's point, you only need 1 million people to try and have a tech ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, everything that's happening over there, it's absolutely fantastic. And then, again, part of the trip was to realize what we could learn from Miami and what we could do here.
What did you learn?
Again, I'm still processing a bunch of stuff.
No, it's the best time. You process in real time.
But the first thing is, we're still a long way to go, and a lot of it is just going to be time. So a lot of the things that we're working on, and at one point, we looked at everyone from the delegation that was in Israel, and we were all only doing what we were doing in the tech ecosystem for under 2 years. So we're really just getting, and these are supposed to be, aside from me, the leaders of the tech ecosystem here in Miami, right? So when everyone who's leading the tech ecosystem has only been doing it for under 2 years, that's when you know, all right, you know what, we have 10, 15, 20 years to go. Yep. And patience, right? I think, you know, we all want success stories. You know, I run an angel investor network, so we want Googles, we want Facebooks, we want to make a lot of money with our investments. But it's just going to take time.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Accelerated Growth Partners and what you're doing here. What are some of the cool things, most interesting things that are happening on the ground here? So
we're an angel investor network, so that means we're not a fund, there's no committed capital. We're a collective of 80 individual investors where we basically centralize sourcing, screening, and due diligence of early stage Miami-based tech companies. Miami, I mean South Florida. What's interesting that's happening is we've had 6 investment meetings. Out of those meetings, we've made 9 investments, totaling $1.6 million. And for most of those $1.6 million, it was people writing their first check in early stage tech. So that to me is, aside from the fact that it's $1.6 million that were not being invested before here, or in technology at all, it's the fact that people are so interested. Everyone knows and can feel that there's something happening, and everyone is super active in wanting in. So from the entrepreneur standpoint, it's saying, why should you go to Miami? Why should you stay in Miami? It's because this, at this point, is the most open, fertile city to be in. If you want to be an entrepreneur, build your company, raise money, take space at the Miami, whatever, this is the friendliest city. I think it's almost to an extent where it's almost cliche-ic. We're happy-go-lucky. You know, we all need to help each other, and that will end soon at some point.
Cutthroat Miami.
It will. It will, right? If you go to
Real Housewives of Technology Miami.
No, but I mean, that was unfair. But no, if you go to the Valley, if you go to Silicon Valley, people are killing each other over the good deals, right? If I'm investing, I don't want to let anyone know that I'm investing. Here, every time we invest, I need to call everyone else who's willing to write a check and say, hey, we're investing, why don't you invest?
And also in the Valley and other places, the competition for talent, not just for deals. Yeah. I mean, stealing engineers, stealing people. One of the things I was telling Matt earlier that I think is such a great takeaway from your trip is, a long time ago, I benchmarked the earliest startup ecosystems, and I went to Austin. The people who built the Austin, this was almost 2 decades ago, said one of the most important things, what they called them benchmarking trips. It was just what you guys did. They took a group of people, they took them out of their environment, they brought them, wherever they brought them, the Valley, or Boston in those days. They said the ability to build a community that comes from that thing. So I was encouraging Matt and encouraging you guys to keep this going. I think it's a way of not only learning, but building community. Shaun, a couple questions for you. Shaun Abrahamson is the founder of Urban.us, fund startups that can positively impact 100 cities within 5 years. And he has lots of interests. We can talk about some of them in a minute. But what do you think from what you've seen through your work? What do you see are some of the most interesting, maybe under the radar ecosystems that are growing up? And maybe how do you see this paradoxical and challenging thing called Miami fitting in?
So I'll start off and say we sort of organize a little bit differently in the sense that we have a little over 400 people that are advising that spend a couple of hours a month. And so I view a lot of things through that lens. So if someone says to me, is this ecosystem better than this other ecosystem? For the people that live there, maybe, but a lot of the most interesting people, okay, so Bedy lives on a plane. So you can ask her where she lives, but she moves around a lot, right? John, I think you also said you travel a fair amount. And so some of the questions that are more interesting are where do people spend a little bit of their time, right? And that, to me, is the part that's interesting for us in Miami. So to give you an example, we manage all the relationships, again, 400 plus, all over at this point, mainly the US, but a couple in Europe, some in Africa. And we do an annual event because we want everyone to actually meet in one place. And so we get on the phone with people and we say, oh, we're doing this event. It's very cool. It's all about cities. We're going to talk about waste and water and security and we're getting and eventually we go, and how are you enjoying winter? Because it's going to be in Miami in April.
I want to come.
Right. So
count me in.
And so our sort of view is that totally becomes a really interesting asset over time. Maybe they'll spend a week, and some of them will come back or be interested in setting up. They don't have to found the company here, but if they set up their second office after San Francisco, so something like SHIP is very interesting. I don't know if people talked about that, but they went, I think, San Francisco, New York, Miami. Well, they're going to build out an operation here. They have certain experience. They have certain relationship with investors. Miami may have been number 10 on that list in terms of building out cities, and now it's number 3. So I think those are interesting. I think for us, if people visit Miami and some of them decide to stay or some of them decide to have a headquarters here, that's where it becomes interesting.
I think you said something that's really profound and that this city needs more than any, because there still is a tension here between those who live here and those who visit here. And it's in any less here than in the Cape Cods of the world, but it's here. And what you're saying is it's a huge advantage. The visitor thing, and in a way, I was just talking to Veronica, and they were saying Miami is kind of like Las Vegas and LA, only 100 times better. And what the mayor talks about making the new convention center a center for idea exchange is very powerful. That if you have a place people want to come to meet, think about Las Vegas, the conventions they have there. If you have a place people that want to come to meet, it can be more powerful, as powerful or more powerful than a place people want to come to stay, or at least an additional asset. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to take seriously. People really do. And it has some absences that are probably inhibiting from making a fundamental location decision. They want to come here from some span of time, and we have to take advantage of it. You're right.
So, I mean, the personal experience on this, and I know you like data and other people like data, it's not a big data set, it's a data set of one, and that's my wife. And when we moved to Miami, part of the thinking was Art Basel, she's an artist, and the local, art scene has grown tremendously around that. And so there's some correlation. I don't know the causation model there exactly, but there's some halo effect of having interesting things happen and having people visit and having some of those people stay for longer and contribute in some way. But I have a harder time saying to people, you need to move, and here's why you need to move. I get the Latin America sort of hub of hubs thing is genius. I don't know if we can convince people living in Berlin doing a hardware startup that this would be a more natural fit for them.
But my data point of one, also a wife who's much more extroverted than me, is that we see more people here. And we live part-time in New York and part-time in Toronto. We see more people who come to visit us here than any place we have ever lived. So there is a flow of people from, not just from one place, from every country in the world, including Israel, who all come through here. So I think there is something about weather and amenity and airport, we can go down the list, that makes this a meeting and mixing pot that we need to take very seriously, and we can't figure that out. I think this has been a great and rich discussion. We have time if anybody wants for at least one question. We can try to get 2 if you're quick. Go ahead.
So in all the other startup destinations that we've seen, the academic institutions have played a very major role. The students, to the professors, to the alumni network they bring along and all of that. What kind of a participation are we seeing here in the South Florida area from the academic institutions?
Sure, I'll start. So I think the talent thing has been addressed throughout the day. From what we've seen with our companies, we have had no significant trouble finding really great people here. I think the only person that maybe you will not find in Miami is the rockstar CTO that will invent the next wave of the internet. Fine, that person may not be here, but you can find really good junior, semi-senior, and senior people here in Miami from all walks of life and whatever you want to find. As to the role of academic institutions, we have, I think, what has to be one of the coolest, greatest institutions that I've ever come across here in the US, which is Miami-Dade College, right? They have 165,000 students. They graduate more Hispanics and blacks and people from low-income communities than any other educational institution in the country. I think FIU graduates more engineers than any other university in the country. Fine, these are not top-tier, Stanford, Harvard, Technion level institutions, but there's critical mass. And going back to data, I think that out of 167,000 students, there's got to be a few rock stars in there. And I think it's more about how do we connect those people effectively, those students, how do we give them opportunities, how do we hook them up with launch code, have them go to these conferences, et cetera, so that they become involved.
So a couple things. One, I think a big challenge is going to be how do we make this place an idea capital? And my model for that is very simply an institution that looks like this, that what the New World Symphony did for modern contemporary classical music for ideas. And Startup City Miami is part of that. Secondly, we attract a shitload of students. I mean, this is one of the biggest college towns in the world. It is like a Boston or a DC and way bigger than an Ann Arbor or Boulder. Three, our institutions are pretty cool. You mentioned Miami-Dade, University of Miami. Last year, after doing Startup Miami and one other thing, I developed a great partnership. I see some of my colleagues at FIU. We have developed the most amazing partnership between my company, the Creative Class Group, and FIU. We have an office right across the way. I see my colleague Roberto Bryan was here. And we're developing cutting-edge research on the creative economy. We thought we're going to release it this year. We're thinking that we got to dig in for another year. But boy, oh boy, and the quality of my colleagues there are mind-blowing. I mean, there are great people. So I think that the question is, we have all the components. Now we have to take them to the next level. And I think, personal bias, this area of startup, arts, culture, design, architecture, what Dash did to be the greatest high school for Dash, right, the Design Academy, I think Miami can offer that to the world. Do we have time for one more question? I know I've run over, but one more.
I have a question. Several of you have talked about startups in developing worlds in Africa, in the Middle East, and Latin America. I mean, if there's something about innovation is that it takes a challenge to come up with an idea to get around it. And you're talking about parts of the world where we have lots of challenges. What have you learned about those entrepreneurs that entrepreneurs and startups in Miami can benefit from?
So a lot of the entrepreneurs we see in emerging economy, they are looking, like the way we like to, especially like fund the companies, is when they look at the opportunities and how the technology can really make that a lot more efficient. One thing that really strikes me really often in the entrepreneurs in those places that I think I don't see as often, especially compared to the Bay Area entrepreneurs that's sort of streamwise, is they are extremely resilient. Like, it doesn't matter what happens, they will be doing that day in, day out. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. I think the question is, when should you like sort of move to your next thing, right? So very often when you look at some of the companies we have, for instance, like in Brazil, they would just stay longer because they try to find different ways to like work around the business model because they really care about those sort of causes. And very often in the Bay Area, because opportunity and cost of opportunity is so big that they might be like switching really quick every 6 to 12 months to the next opportunity. So I think it's really finding that balance between like, you're seeing a lot of opportunities, do you flip really quickly versus like something that you really deeply care about on the challenges and use technology to make that a lot more efficient.
The time has flown on this panel. I'd like to thank Bedy, Jon, Shaun, and Nico, and thank all of you. You're great.
Thank you.